everyone. Thank you for coming on this very cold day. Hopefully it's not the first day of winter. So I really appreciate your presence, and I also would like to thank the YMCA and Tyler for inviting me to be part of this lecture series. It's a pleasure. Thank you, everyone. So today I'm here to talk to you about what I think is a really big topic. I feel that it's huge, but I'm kind of, responding to the priorities of the lecture series. I mean, it's on global development and global partnerships. So maybe there is a way we can make whatever we have to offer relevant to this very topic. And I think it is relevant. But I come to it with the perspective that scholarship that we do from the periphery is actually very important in understanding the global. And maybe it will help us rethink and rethink the global in ways that make sense to all of us. So bear with me. So my title has actually gone through a few changes from the time I agreed to do this to today, I guess to a few days ago. So at first, I was interested in looking at scholarship from West Africa. But then more and more, as I was preparing this presentation, I realized that here I'm actually talking about the whole continent. Because if we're, as a starting point, looking at what's happening on the continent in terms of social science research, and I have to say from the beginning that my focus is on social science and humanities, right? Because when we think about knowledge production, knowledge from the sciences too, it's something that's really important, that when you look at the World Bank reports or UNESCO reports, they are there. But the focus isn't on science research, it's really social science and humanities in Africa, but also placing it within a larger Africanist perspective. When I say Africanist scholars in the global academy, I'm not only talking about scholars in Africa, on the continent, but also outside, to kind of, make the global academy, place it in a position that makes sense and where we can see trends happening. I also have to mention that for this presentation, I'm not really interested in looking at trends from a policy perspective. Like the first thing I looked at was the World Social Science Report. Now, when you look at the numbers, of course, the story of Africa isn't really great. We could come look at the numbers and just focus on the fact that sub-Saharan Africa, or even the continent, well, sub-Saharan Africa for that, has produced very insignificant research when we look at the big number. Like when you look at the number 1%, right? Removing from that, group of countries from North Africa, the rest that we call sub-Saharan Africa, we don't see much coming up in terms of number of articles and number of, monographs, just production of knowledge in general in terms of what's being produced. I don't think that those discussions will help us. But I think what will really be productive for myself and for all of us is really to go beyond the numbers and also ask the question, well, what is being done in terms of the quality of knowledge production? And I think we always have to go back to what are the priorities for those on the continent who are trying to make meaning out of research, who are trying to make sense of what's being produced and making sure that it's relevant to universities on the continent. Then I think this discussion, we have to place it, in a perfect way. I mean, in a way that makes sense to them, but also to us as Africanists throughout in the global academy. Now, the global academy, when it comes to Africa, I don't think that it's really hard to explain what it means, because the African continent has actually been in touch with the global academy for centuries, right? And here, that was very useful in terms of even providing a background for this presentation. So what I did that I hope would make sense was look at it in a point from a very interdisciplinary perspective, right? And focusing on the discipline of history. I know there are historians in the room, so I decided maybe it would be safe to start from there. And for Africa, actually, that makes a lot of sense, because when we talk about knowledge production, the kind of knowledges or even knowledge systems that have been produced, we can focus on different angles. If you look at just oral productions, that is actually in a way that what has put Africa more and more in the margins, because for a long time, people throughout thought that knowledge production was just based on oral records, but that has been proven to be wrong. If you ask people like Professor Nobili, here working on the manuscripts of Timbuktu, he'll tell you that, no, there's a lot to be seen, there's a lot to be studied and understood. And actually, there's a lot we can do to make Africa have a better place in the global academy. You also look at traditional knowledge systems. I'm indigenous. I'm sorry for using the term traditional, but indigenous knowledge systems in Africa that throughout the continent have also played a major role in what we can call production of knowledge, right? But for this particular presentation, I'm really focusing on actually written knowledge. I'm focusing on that because there is a way to do that, and I think we should. And the reason why we should do that is because that, I think, will help us understand the global academy better, and also the written documents that are sitting there that we, for the last 15 years, I'll say, have received more and more international recognition, have been there. But it's just that it's now that foundations and more scholars have actually decided that it's time we put attention to those productions. So what I'm going to do here is, after looking at the discipline of history, and here I have to be selective, because the study of Africa is actually huge when you look at from the perspective of the disciplines. So I can't cover every discipline, but just going from the history discipline, maybe there's something we can learn that can come from that. And then in the second part of the presentation, what I try to do is approach it from a very area studies orientation, like what has become of the African studies enterprise, looking at it from an area studies perspective. I mean, as somebody who works at the Center for African Studies, I think it's also important once we leave the disciplinary lens, to kind of place the study of Africa in a more interdisciplinary perspective. But you'll see that in my attempt of doing that, what I do is use I'm not really focusing on the kind of knowledge that is produced, but the generations of African intellectuals that have been present from centuries ago. And here we can even start with our famous Ahmed Baba, as you can see in this quote, from the Pan-Africanist and one of the most influential African intellectuals on the continent, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, first president of independent Ghana. And this was from a speech he made when he was nominated the first chancellor of the University of Ghana in 1961. History tells us, I'm reading it just in case you can see well, history tells us of the great medieval civilizations of Africa and the part that high institutions of learning played in the academic and cultural life of the African centers of learning, such as Walata, Djenné, and Timbuktu, had a singular impact on African education in medieval times. There is no doubt that in the University of Sankore, medieval Africa had already qualified to be numbered among the foremost intellectually inspired of the world. If the University of Sankore had not been destroyed, if Professor Ahmed Baba, author of 40 historical works, had not had his works and his university destroyed, if the University of Sankore, as it was in 1591, 16th century, had survived the ravages of foreign invasions, then the academic and cultural history of Africa might have been quite different. So, as we can see here, if we go from the first intellectuals, yes, I want to start with Ahmed Baba. And we could also talk about a Pan-African institution, Pan-African, that there wasn't the existence of Pan-African institutions of higher learning. Because the problem with the development of African studies, one of the major challenges is that when we have a continent divided between North and the rest of the continent, that hasn't been very helpful for the study of Africa. So it is out of the Islamic traditions that these institutions were established. We have Zaytuna, it's since 1732 in Tunis. Karawiyan, established in Fez in 1859. And here, I think the female aspect, the women or gender aspect of this topic is also very important. Just that could have been the focus for this presentation. Al-Azhar was established in Cairo in 1969, the same year that the city was founded by the Fatimid dynasty from the Maghreb. So, but in West Africa too, these institutions were there, but I think what I'm trying to show here is really the connections that existed between these two regions that tend to be separated in African historiography or in many disciplines in African studies. Oh, sorry. And then for a more, coming from an epistemological order, we can see that the fact that these institutions of learning were dismissed didn't really help the whole discipline, of history or even others that developed afterwards. Because what we found out later, even when you ask people who are right now spending so much in terms of what do we do to make the educational system relevant, to make the universities, have the universities respond to the needs of African countries, the problem is not really, as I see it, of quantity, how much is produced, but the quality of the knowledge production. What kind of epistemological framework is in place to make sure that what's produced is actually responding to the needs of African countries? So in the case of West Africa, we see that something was started. There was a foundation, a historical foundation that we could call, that we could see that was there ready for a basis for higher education that kind of disappeared slowly. Currently, there is a lot of work being done in terms of debating the colonial library, because as we know, much of Africa's higher education system is actually based on what was produced by the colonizers. So right now, there's a lot going on in terms of, work that's being done. Again, I go back to what's being done on the continent in terms of making sense of what these universities should be, what's the foundation. So in a book published in 2012, and the following one in 2016, non-Europhone intellectuals, which is actually a follow-up. Beyond Tombouctou is a follow-up to non-European intellectuals. Here, Professor Ousmane Khan of Harvard University actually tells us, well, we hear a lot about Tombouctou, but it's not just about Tombouctou. Tombouctou, really what happened there was within a larger West African framework, right? But we can still call it the capital of West African higher education that had connections with the rest of the continent. Especially there we saw links between North Africa and West Africa, a real link, because people were not just producing knowledge going back and forth, but they were actually, there were exchanges, real exchanges that maybe we could learn from today when we think about making the partnerships, the international partnerships that we have between African universities and Western universities make sense. And here I'm going to go back to a paper I wrote in 2012. It was presented at a conference organized by the Council for the the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, CODESURIA, which I'll probably mention later, where I was actually discussing the role of international partnerships when it comes to African higher education. What's being done that's actually really advancing African universities. Here, in addition to problems of funding, funding is always at the core of many of the problems that African institutions are going through right now. In addition to funding, you also have issues around setting up the research agenda. What should be at the agenda of these research institutes? So here I go to a quote by Félix Dubois. He was a French explorer who was actually focusing and wrote a lot of books about his travels in French West Africa. Just to kind of show that link, that these were real links. The scholars of Tombouctou yielded in nothing to the scent in their sojourns in the foreign universities in Fez, Tunis, and Cairo. They astounded the most learned men of Islam by their erudition. That the Negroes were on a level with the Arabian savants is proven by the fact that they were installed as professors in Morocco and Egypt. In contrast to this, we find that the Arabs were not always equal to the requirements of Sankore. Now, I'm sure Dr. Nobili will tell you more about that, because in my work, I am part of those who are not actually looking at things textually, but looking at it more generally. So he's doing interesting work in looking at these documents and what they really mean from a social science but also humanities perspective. So here I'm just showing this map to kind of show you the links that were there. And here, as you can see, East Africa is another part of the African continent that we can also go to in terms of looking at these historical documents. So from there, I'm going to talk about the British historians and the discipline of history. And from there, again, show you that what was going on the continent was actually started, officially, but we know that it rested on something that was already solid. So before the late 1940s, there was no written history of Africa in the Western academic tradition that considered the African perspective of events. Neither was there a general history of the whole African continent published before 1950s. So although we are saying that Eurocentric historiography was very problematic, we also know that it was a process where Western colonial critics such as Basil Davidson and Roland Oliver were already writing different African or colonial histories. These historians challenged the imperial historiographical hegemony, resulting in the 50s into a new African historiography. So it also was the case that the discipline of history became recognized as a formal discipline. But what happened, and here that's what I found really interesting, is that these scholars, once they got their training in Africa, were actually able to take that to have important posts as either chairs of departments in their countries back to Europe. So that was the case for British historians, but also that was the case for the French, for instance, which I don't really touch much on this, in this presentation. So there were, in the publications, you can see that there was some development, like from the Journal of African History, which was published launched in 1960. It's a useful exercise to actually just look at the kind of articles that were published there and who were publishing in these journals. Although you have a generation of African historians on the continent coming up as people who had some authority in the field, they were not really represented in these journals. And I did also a quick overview of the production, the articles, just the journals, coming from the French tradition, like the Cahiers d'études africaines was also the same thing. And for the most part, that's why looking at this from an anthropological point of view is kind of depressing, because I guess history offers something that at least we could, we could live with. So, so from the institutionalization of the discipline of African history, we slowly move on to decolonization in Africa and the construction of national universities. And here, this is where we have some kind of space where African historians who had received an education, like around the time their contemporaries were also receiving their education, but who were more coming from a Eurocentric perspective, started to actually play a major role in the study of Africa. For instance, and that also meant that some of the African nations who were able to establish universities, I mean, even though you had one university per nation that actually replaced the more regional universities, this was actually the place where we saw many, Africanists and African intellectuals kind of having some kind of fruitful exchanges, and that was really helpful. But still, we see that universities were also always connected to the metropole. For instance, when the University of Dakar was established, a decree from the French Ministry of Education named it the 18th university in French higher education, in the French higher education system. So those connections that were not very easy, it was not really easy to cut off that connection with the former colonizer, and that too had some kind of influence in the kind of work that was produced, if any. So there was, on the other hand, a strong desire to further debunk Eurocentric narratives on Africa over centuries of slavery, colonization, and neo-colonialism. These were historical moments in which the unequal exchanges and engagement between Africa and European worlds were produced and reproduced. But there was also some major international initiatives like the UNESCO Commission and two-phase volume, The General History of Africa, that took more than 10 years to actually work on this, which was actually a competitor to the Cambridge History of Africa. That, I think I mentioned it in the previous slide, which was edited by Roland Oliver and John Fage. But then if you look at the UNESCO General History of Africa, there was a concern that what was being produced was not actually coming from African voices. So as you can see, the people here who I mentioned, Ajayi of Nigeria, Amadou Hampâté-Bâ of Mali, Cheikh Anta Diop of Senegal, and then the list continues, were all based on the continent and were thinking from kind of an Afrocentric perspective. But later, we actually have a more Afrocentric perspective when you look at works produced by people like Cheikh Anta Diop, for instance. You can see the African origins of civilization, myth or reality, that was written in 1989, but published much later, was actually proposing a Black African origin, or defending a Black African origin for the civilizations of ancient Egypt. So that was a big change from what was produced that actually was rested on the concept of a no history for Africa. So here you see that also they were expanding research agendas. Oh, sorry, I think I missed a slide. So just to kind of summarize there, that from a time when we are saying Africa had no history to a time where we are moving where Africans were more and more involved in the production of knowledge, especially in the discipline of history, there was actually some success in terms of rewriting Africa's history. So from there, I'm going to move up a little bit to talk about the United States and the links with the whole, the institutionalization of African studies in the US. Because there too, what we see, there is some kind of parallel that exists between what went on in the US in terms of interest in African studies. And here what we see, we can also lump into the whole concept of inequity, because when we talk about institutionalization of African studies in the United States, we can really start from there, but for the purposes of the presentation, I'm starting from there. But I just want to mention quickly that the people who were the pioneers in the study of Africa were actually many black nationalists in this country. But because of the kind of work they produced and the fact that it didn't really respond to the needs of the country and those who had authority over what was to be studied. Of course, after World War II, there was a need to know the rest of the world. There we started seeing development of area studies, African studies, and other world areas were more and more gaining more recognition. But what we see here is that there's a big gap in terms of interest in African studies in this country. But I just wanted to mention that very quickly to say that when the US started interest in African studies, or the study of Africa, there was a 1958 National Defense Education Act, which was a turning point in the institutionalization of African studies in post-World II years. It mandated the creation of world areas at American universities under what's called Title VI. We here at the University of Illinois have many Title VI centers, and our center has been one of them depending on the cycle. So the focus was on area studies, but also language studies, which shows some commitment to actually understand Africa from a lens that was more and more, the lenses were changing. The topics were becoming more and more diverse. More and more disciplines were actually coming together. So that by mid-1990s, the African studies programs funded by the National Defense Act doubled and were redesigned as Title VI centers. So for the US, that was a key point. Now, by the 1990s, Title VI targeted mainly large institutions with large numbers of faculty and state institutions with solid international programs. So what that meant was that research agendas were expanding. And once we had a strong architecture in place, then we saw the emergence of, for instance, new journals, like the International Journal of African Historical Studies in 1958, the African Studies Review in 1958, the first one in 58, the African Studies Review in 1968, Research in African Literatures in 1970. Now from here, we see that there was, starting with the 1990s, there was 1930s. The discipline of anthropology and archaeology dominated the field of African studies and took center stage as the legitimators of knowledge about Africa. Northwestern University under Herskovits devoted considerable resources in developing a comprehensive Africana library and the first African studies program. But although, with all the work produced, what we see is that the focus was more on anthropological research than anything else. And that was also very problematic in terms of where we wanted the study of Africa to go. And just to kind of give you an example of how problematic that has been, or that was and continue to be, is that when in preparing this presentation, I wanted to ask, current Africanists, they span from, I'll say what I call the early intellectual, the first generation of intellectual, to the maybe what we want to call the fourth generation of intellectuals, just looking at, just kind of asking, what do they think constitute the main factors in terms of getting a place, like making sure they have a place in this global academy? And one of actually two of the scholars mentioned that it is unfortunate that we still see a divide in African studies between African studies and Middle Eastern studies. That creates problems for those who work on Islamic Africa, for instance. They consider too much Africanist by Islamists or too much Islamists by Africanists. So that is not really helping the field. And also, that has an implication in terms of when we say funding for African research. Funding for African research has always suffered as a result of Africa as a whole being at the bottom of strategic interests in the US or European political and economic thinking. So as you know, in the last, I'll say over almost 2 decades, right? Or maybe less than that. Maybe in the last decade or so, there's been heightened interest in areas called the Middle East that have been more and more detached from continental Africa. And that, when we think of coming up with an epistemology that makes sense for Africa or African studies, that hasn't really proved very helpful. So back to the US, there was some divisions which go back to the iniquities I'm talking about here, which actually brought a lot of reactions among Black Americans who were interested in the study of Africa, and that in reaction to the locational bias of African studies, predominantly at major Title VI centers, and the delinking of the field of African studies from its diaspora, the separation of North Africa from Sub-Saharan Africa, members of the ASA Black Caucus disrupted the annual meeting of the African Studies Association in Montreal that happened in 1969. And then after that, there were the creation of a joint committee on African studies, which re-examined its position on the issue of boundaries and broadening the scope of its work to include Africa outside its continental borders. So 2 organizations were born, the African Heritage Studies Association and the Association of Concerned Africans. So these were also major developments within the US. And then also the ASA opened up its membership for panels organized by both organizations and created a new journal to accommodate scholarly debates on politically charged issues. And that's how the Journal of Opinion was established in 1971. So there is a lot of paradigm shift when it comes to the study of Africa. So this is where I make the transition to bring in the various generations of African scholars that I think, or somebody like Kandawire divided up in 3 generations, and right now we are wondering what's happening to the 4th generation. So by the 1970s, and because of the crisis of African higher education, more attention was given to the research needs of African scholars. The 1980s were actually very important in terms of African brain drain, as most African countries experienced deep economic crisis. A significant number of scholars actually joined the American institutions. That was very, I think, a key moment for both the continent, but also the US. But what it meant for the field of African studies in general was that we see that agendas for research were being more and more diverse. Well, time is running. So just to summarize, the question here is what happens to the generations, the various generations of African intellectuals. We know that the 1970s, there was some euphoria in terms of production of knowledge. The second generation had to deal with African governments that were really involved in making sure that development was going on, which meant that many scholars were actually silenced. They didn't have the space needed to produce the kind of research that made sense for Africa, and which meant that these generations, generation after generation, the gap between them and their counterparts in other parts of the world was not decreasing. To the contrary, the gap was widening more and more. So we see some kind of attempts to reorganize the production of knowledge in Africa, and that's where we have our Pan-African organization, the Quadricia, which I mentioned earlier. And a key part of that, the creation of that organization, was the Kampala Declaration on Academic Freedom, which actually gave some kind of legitimacy to people who were there trying to do work that was important for African higher education and research networks. So here, I guess I want to end with a question: how do we nurture the fourth generation of African intellectuals? We need to move African scholarship into the center, but in order to do that, some major work has to be done, not just in terms of knowledge that's being produced, but also how do we make sure that that is relevant. So the question of relevance is important. The question of funding is, again, I guess everything is tied to it. But also we can say that research agendas and direction must be determined within the continent by the needs, priorities, and perspectives of the communities at the center of these studies as both subjects and premier beneficiaries. As Makandawire put it, and I think I'm going to end here, in this global era of academic networking, we must begin to combine the working and netting rather than acquiescing to the old age division of labor in which Africans do the working while Westerners do the netting. The biggest challenge for the fourth generation is often epistemological nature. It involves the rediscovery, development, recognition, and validation of African epistemologies and methodologies in the creation and transmission of knowledge. And that would mean going back to work that has been done already, that I started with not just Tombouctou, but other areas of the continent that's really indigenous and built from Africa's knowledge systems and ways of knowing. So I'm sorry it took a little bit longer, but maybe we have 5 minutes for questions.
You mentioned that the writings and the authorship of black nationalists, I assume mostly in the U.S., did not have much impact, didn't really speak to the African condition much. But I'm curious, one, how something like Black Athena might have an effect. And then the other thing is there's an earlier generation of the diaspora, such as Fanon, Richard Burrick, Walter Rodney in English, how Europe, underdeveloped Africa. I know you're more into quantitative and studying but I'm wondering what kind of impacts that have on scholarship. Obviously it had some impact on decolonization efforts, particularly the former. And then as an appendix, you mentioned this university is Sankore, and you said it was destroyed. Do you want to add
Sankore.
I have never heard of its destruction, and I don't know what it represents, so I'm sorry to ask 3 questions. But
okay, well, that's okay. So yes, there were influential African scholars. You mentioned Walter Rodney. There's people like Du Bois who were instrumental. But the problem, as I mentioned earlier, was that when it comes to African studies in the US, we can think of it as, in two different orders. Like the fact that they were not part of the more, how would I call it, the institution of African studies, where the funding went to universities that were already established, the public universities that were already established. The work they did, of course, did have major impact during the decolonization movements and also nationalist movements in Africa. But the issue is, as long as they are not part of the institution, the impact they should make wouldn't be there. So the fact that they were kind of disconnected from the more um, the academics of African studies or the African studies, Africanist enterprise in the US, that made it a little bit hard for them to make the impact that they could have made. But of course, they were influential in making African studies a solid area study, field of study, in comparison to others. And I think also that the Pan-Africanist movement isn't just limited to the US, but also to Africa. And then what's important there is the connections between the two. People like Nkrumah, who went to school, came to school in the US, were already there to build and make sure that those networks stayed. And I think there is part of it that actually stayed to this day, where we can actually think of Pan-Africanism outside of the African continent, but also reaching to places like the US or even the Caribbean. Yeah. So about Sankore, yeah, you can consider it a university, not in terms of we know universities in modern days, but when you think about the amount of work that was produced, the kind of teaching that was taught, the kind of networks that were built thanks to those institutions, yes, we can say there was a university called the University of Sankore that was destroyed. And it was not just Sankore, there were other examples, like the example of Pire in Senegal, that was a university that was destroyed during colonization. When you go to Egypt, for instance, the Alexandria Library was burned down. So there's been a history of institutions, universities, schools, and libraries being destroyed throughout African history that we can go back to as examples. But Sankore is in Mali in current day, was in Mali in current day Tombouctou. Okay, I hope I answered that question. All right. Ken?
Thank you for a great talk. I wanted to just speak to your last point. You opened up by talking about the important institutional affairs, and you could speak to feminist contributions in recovering these epistemologies. And I know there's a lot of things in the lives to talk about it. So a lot of you work about feminists. So what are feminists going to continue towards in the last?
So, of course, because this is a big topic, and when we talk about inequities, we could have, for instance, just focus on the fact that women writers, women scholars in Africa have not received the kind of attention they should receive within the whole academic, global academic, even the Africa, in Africa itself. And I have to mention also that part of the people I talked to about sending me information about how do they view their position in the institution, in their respective institutions they're teaching and researching, in addition to, structural problems that they deal with in their universities, Africanist scholars, female Africanist scholars, I think it's even harder for them in terms of being able to have access to knowledge or also produce knowledge. And there's been studies after studies that have been produced on just the gender dimension of African studies. So I didn't focus really on that because I think it's a topic in itself, but feminist methodologies have a lot to offer, to African studies and the global academy in terms of revising the methodologies that are in place and making sure that they answer to the problems we're going through right now. I can just talk about, some initiatives that have been done in terms of, female production of knowledge. Here, what we have to make sure we understand is that we're gonna have to expand our horizons when it comes to that. We're going to have to be more disciplinary than what we have right now. We're going to have to look at indigenous ways of creating knowledge, whether you're talking about the arts, music, or what have you, to make sure that we're using those feminist methodologies in a way that will be very beneficial to the field of study, African studies, and even beyond. Mm-hmm. Well, well, there are many, but I think for the young audience we have, we can say Wangari Maathai because of the environmental, like when we say who are the most influential environmentalists you can think about in this day and age, I mean, bring up Wangari Maathai and see the kind of connections that we can make in terms of feminist writings, but also going out of the traditional disciplines to talk about the environment and others. Yeah, so that's my pick today.
Is there time for another one?
Maybe one more.
Okay. So I'm curious, most of your talk was situated within institutions, right? Not institutions of knowledge production. When I look at the next generation of African intellectuals and African epistemological production, I think most of it is happening outside of university spaces by necessity. So how do we, within institutions of knowledge production, both draw on and also figure out how to support all of the things being produced in communities and online without taking over them?
Yeah, and I'm glad that's our last question, because I think if you're absolutely right, and that's, I think, one of the issues that we have to work on, because whatever we do, it tends to be based on the institution, because that's how we operate. So that's the challenge that it's starting from us, we have, and the question we ask that is very relevant to all of us, but especially to this fourth generation of African intellectuals, is how do we make sure that what's being produced is actually connected to the communities? Not just connected in terms of what do we offer the communities that we're working for, but how can the communities we're working for inform the kind of work we're doing? And that's, I think, for Africa, if we want to come out and do something and not repeat mistakes that other people have made, because I think it's also an issue. That's an issue in all academic circles, including the United States. So I think that's where areas from the periphery, like Africa, or African countries, and I'm sorry, we have to generalize here, that's where we can come and see, okay, this is how we can make a difference here, because we are talking to the communities, we are responding to the needs, and we are building from what they have to offer in terms of knowledge systems, and that's where I think we can talk about a global academy, but a variety of knowledge systems. And the communities are at the center of those knowledge systems. So I think I'm going to have to end right here. I'm sorry, I'm all over the place, but I tried my best.